There was a time in Earth's deep past when the planet seemed perfectly balanced. Around 260 million years ago, during the late Permian period, the world looked stable in a way that almost feels impossible today. Nearly all land on the planet had merged into a single vast supercontinent known as Pangea. It stretched across the globe like a colossal island, surrounded by warm oceans and filled with ecosystems that had been evolving for hundreds of millions of years. Across that immense landmass, forests spread over valleys and plains in quiet abundance. Tall prehistoric trees formed dense canopies that filtered sunlight onto the ground below. The air was warm and heavy with moisture in many regions, and the rhythm of life moved slowly through these landscapes. Animals wandered through these forests that would appear strange to modern eyes. Large amphibians rested near muddy riverbanks, their bodies perfectly adapted to a world of wetlands and warm climates. Early reptiles moved carefully across fallen logs and thick vegetation, exploring environments that had existed for ages without interruption. Rivers flowed steadily across the continent, carving winding paths through forests and open plains before eventually reaching the coastal seas. These waterways carried nutrients and life through ecosystems that had grown increasingly complex over millions of years. Along the edges of Pangea, warm, shallow seas stretched across wide continental shelves. These oceans were crowded with ancient marine creatures whose ancestors had lived in similar waters long before the first forests appeared on land. Trilobites moved slowly along the seafloor, their segmented bodies gliding over sand and stone. Brachiopods anchored themselves to the ocean floor, opening delicate shells to filter food from the passing currents. Ammonites drifted through the water column, their spiral shells catching faint glimmers of sunlight as they moved through gentle waves. Early fish swam among reefs built by colonies of small organisms that quietly shaped entire marine ecosystems. These reefs formed underwater cities of life, providing shelter for countless creatures that fed, hunted, and reproduced within their protective structures. Everywhere across the planet, life seemed deeply established. Over hundreds of millions of years, evolution had constructed intricate food chains linking land, sea, and atmosphere. Plants absorbed sunlight and fed entire ecosystems. Herbivores grazed across forests and wetlands. Predators hunted carefully among the shadows. The system functioned with remarkable stability. For generation after generation, species adapted slowly to their surroundings, refining their survival strategies until ecosystems operated like carefully balanced networks. Each creature had a role. Each environment supported life suited to its conditions. To any observer standing within that world, the Earth would have seemed calm, productive, and enduring. Nothing suggested that such a system could suddenly unravel. The forests still stood tall. The oceans remained full of life. The atmosphere held steady, carrying winds and rains that sustained ecosystems across the planet. Yet beneath this appearance of permanence, the Earth itself was beginning to change. Far below the surface, deeper than any root or river could reach, heat and pressure were gathering within the planet's mantle. These forces moved slowly through the interior of the Earth, building energy that would one day find its way upward. The creatures living on the surface could not sense it. They continued their lives within forests, rivers, and seas that seemed as stable as the ground beneath their feet. But the quiet balance that had sustained life for so long was already beginning to shift in ways no organism could see. The world still appeared complete. Yet hidden within the depths of the planet, the first movements of a transformation were already underway, one that would soon test the resilience of life itself. The world of the late Permian did not simply contain large continents. It contained almost all of them at once. Across the surface of the Earth stretched a single vast landmass known as Pangea, a supercontinent so immense that it reshaped the planet's geography and climate in ways that no modern world map can truly convey. From one pole to the other, land connected in a nearly continuous sweep of mountains, plains, forests, and deserts. Oceans still surrounded the continent, but the interior of this giant landmass lay far from their influence. At first glance, Pangea might seem like little more than an unusual arrangement of land. But geography has quiet power. The placement of continents determines how wind travels across the planet, how oceans circulate heat, and how moisture moves through the atmosphere. When the continents merged into Pangea, the entire climate system of the Earth began shifting. Near the coasts, life still flourished much as it had before. Moist air rising from nearby seas fed forests that spread along the continental edges. Rivers carried water deep inland, sustaining wetlands where amphibians and early reptiles moved among dense vegetation. But farther toward the center of the continent, the environment began to change. Without nearby oceans to moderate temperatures, the interior of Pangea grew increasingly extreme. Summers bake the land under relentless heat. Winters could drop suddenly into cold, dry conditions. Rainfall became scarce, and wide deserts formed across regions that once held thriving ecosystems. The distance from the sea made these lands unpredictable. Animals living there faced a world where survival depended not only on food or predators, but on the shifting moods of the climate itself. Drought could stretch across entire seasons. Dust storms moved through open plains. Vegetation struggled to remain stable in soils that dried and cracked beneath a harsh sun. Life adapted where it could, but the balance was becoming delicate. Even the oceans surrounding Pangea were beginning to feel the effects of the continent's enormous presence. With such a massive landmass interrupting normal circulation patterns, ocean currents began moving differently than they had in earlier Aze. Water collected in some other areas became strangely stagnant. In some parts of the sea, oxygen levels began slowly declining. The change was subtle, barely noticeable at first. Most marine life continued its familiar patterns, rifting through warm currents or feeding across the seafloor as it had for millions of years. Yet beneath the surface, the chemistry of the oceans was beginning to shift. These were not dramatic changes that animals could immediately sense. No single storm signal that something was wrong. No sudden disaster swept across the land. Instead, the transformation unfolded quietly over long stretches of time. The forest still stood. The ocean still carried life in astonishing numbers. Predators still hunted across plains and shallow reefs. From the perspective of the creatures living in that world, the Earth still seemed reliable. But hidden beneath the appearance of stability, pressure was building within the systems that sustained life. Climate patterns were becoming more volatile. Ecosystems were adapting to conditions that grew slightly harsher with each passing generation. The world was not collapsing, but it was becoming vulnerable. And vulnerability has a way of inviting forces that can push a system beyond its limits. Far below the deserts and forests of Pangea, beneath layers of rock that no creature had ever seen, heat was rising slowly through the mantle of the earth. The continent resting above it remained unaware. On the surface, life continued its ancient rhythms. But deep within the planet, something far larger than shifting climates was beginning to move. Far beneath the forests of Pangea, below rivers, deserts, and the quiet lives of animals that walked the surface, the earth was slowly changing. The crust that seemed solid and permanent from above was only a thin skin resting atop a restless interior. Beneath it, deep within the mantle, enormous reservoirs of molten rock were gathering heat and pressure that had been building for millions of years. These forces moved slowly, almost imperceptibly, but their patience concealed tremendous power. In the region that would one day be known as Siberia, something unusual was beginning to happen. Deep underground, molten rock was rising through weaknesses in the crust. It did not move violently at first. Instead, it crept upward through fractures and faults, slowly forcing the overlying rock apart. As the pressure increased, the ground above began to shift and crack. The first eruptions were modest by volcanic standards. Small fissures opened across the landscape. Gases escaped into the air. Pockets of magma pushed upward and spilled onto the surface in scattered flows. For creatures living nearby, the events may have appeared no more significant than distant storms or occasional earthquakes. Volcanoes were not unknown in Earth's history. The planet had erupted countless times before without destroying life. So when the first cracks opened in the crust, nothing suggested that the world was standing at the edge of its greatest biological crisis. The eruptions were isolated. Lava cooled and hardened into black stone across the landscape. The air carried the faint smell of sulfur. Ash drifted briefly through the sky before settling back onto the ground. Elsewhere across Pangea, life continued almost unchanged. Forests swayed in warm winds. Amphibians hunted along riverbanks. Marine creatures drifted through shallow seas where coral-like reefs still supported rich ecosystems. From the perspective of animals living thousands of kilometers away, nothing at all seemed different. But deep underground, the forces driving these eruptions were not weakening. They were growing stronger. What was forming beneath Siberia was not a single volcano or even a chain of mountains. It was something far larger, a geological phenomenon that had rarely occurred in Earth's history. Instead of erupting through a single cone, magma was forcing its way through long fractures in the crust, creating vast fissures where molten rock could spill directly onto the surface. When lava emerged from these openings, it did not flow in small rivers. It spread across the land in enormous sheets. Each eruption released floods of molten rock capable of covering landscapes the size of modern countries. As the lava cooled, it formed thick layers of dark basalt stone, stacking one upon another over immense areas. Scientists would later call this formation the Siberian Traps. The name comes from the step-like layers of basalt that remain today, silent evidence of the unimaginable eruptions that created them. Yet the rocks we see now represent only the final shape of an event that once reshaped the planet itself. Because the eruptions did not happen all at once. They continued again and again, pouring lava across the surface for hundreds of thousands of years. Each eruption released not only molten rock but enormous quantities of gases trapped deep within the Earth. Carbon dioxide, methane, and sulfur compounds escaped into the atmosphere in volumes that slowly began altering the planet's delicate balance. But the transformation had not yet fully begun. For now, the surface world still appeared mostly unchanged. Animals walked ancient paths through forests. Oceans carried life through warm currents. The planet still seemed stable beneath the sky. Only the land in the distant north showed signs that something unusual was unfolding. The ground cracked. Lava spread. The air filled with volcanic gases. And with each new eruption, the Earth was moving closer to a catastrophe that would soon reach far beyond the region where the first fissures had opened. At first, the tremors beneath the land were subtle, little more than restless shifts deep within the crust. But slowly, the pressure that had been building beneath northern Pangea finally found its path to the surface. The ground began to break. Across a vast region of what is now Siberia, the Earth's crust split open, along enormous fractures. These were not the narrow openings of a typical volcano. Instead, the land itself tore apart in long jagged lines that stretched across the horizon. From these openings, molten rock surged upward from deep within the mantle, spilling onto the surface in glowing rivers of fire. The first flows of lava moved slowly across the land, consuming forests and filling valleys with liquid stone. Trees ignited instantly. Rivers boiled away into clouds of steam. Entire ecosystems that had existed for millions of years vanished within hours beneath waves of heat. Yet what made these eruptions truly extraordinary was not their violence, but their persistence. Ordinary volcanoes erupt and then fall silent. Sometimes for centuries. These eruptions did not stop. Again and again, new fissures opened across the landscape. Each rupture released fresh torrents of molten rock that spread outward across the continent. Lava flowed for kilometers at a time, filling lowlands and covering plains in thick sheets of basalt. When the molten rock cooled, it hardened into dark layers of stone. But the quiet that followed each eruption never lasted long. Soon another fissure would split the ground. Another flood of lava would pour across the land. Over time, the scale of these eruptions became almost unimaginable. Layer after layer of hardened basalt spread across enormous regions of the planet. Eventually, the volcanic province would cover an area larger than modern Western Europe. Entire forests disappeared beneath these expanding plains of black stone. Animals living near the eruptions had little chance of survival. Heat radiated from the advancing lava flows, scorching vegetation long before the molten rock arrived. Thick clouds of ash darkened the sky. The air itself became difficult to breathe as volcanic gases filled the atmosphere. But even this devastation represented only part of the unfolding catastrophe. Each eruption released enormous quantities of gases trapped deep within the Earth. Carbon dioxide poured into the atmosphere in vast volumes. Methane and sulfur compounds followed, drifting upward from the molten rock and spreading across the sky. Unlike lava which as it touched, these gases could travel across the entire planet. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the chemistry of the atmosphere began to change. Carbon dioxide acid wrapped heat from the sun, preventing it from escaping back into space. Rainfall patterns shifted as climate systems struggled to adjust to the warming world. The transformation did not happen overnight. For animals living across Pangea, the world still looked mostly familiar. Forests continued to grow in many regions. Rivers still carried water toward the oceans. The seasons still turned in their usual rhythm. Yet the environment was becoming less predictable. Summers grew hotter, droughts stretched longer. Some forests began thinning as plants struggled to adapt to shifting climates. In the oceans, subtle changes in water temperature began influencing marine ecosystems that had once seemed stable. Nothing about the changes suggested an immediate catastrophe. Instead, the world appeared to be declining slowly, almost quietly. But the eruptions beneath Siberia were still continuing. With each new pulse of lava and gas, the atmosphere moved further away from the delicate balance that had supported life for so long. The land burned where lava reached it. The air warmed far beyond the volcanic fields. And while the surface of the planet was already changing, the most dangerous consequences of these eruptions were only beginning to unfold. Because the atmosphere was not the only system being transformed. Far out in the ancient seas, where most life on Earth still existed, the warming world was about to trigger changes even more deadly than fire. While fire spread across parts of the land, a slower and more unsettling transformation was beginning far from the volcanic fields. The oceans, which held most of the planet's life, were quietly responding to the changes in the atmosphere. For millions of years, the seas had operated as a vast living system. Warm water near the surface moved slowly across the globe, while colder currents sank and circulated through the depths. These movements carried oxygen from the atmosphere deep into the ocean, allowing countless marine creatures to survive far below the sunlight. But as volcanic gases accumulated in the air, the balance began to shift. The planet warmed. At first, the change seemed small. Surface waters absorbed slightly more heat from the sun, and the temperature of the seas began rising. Yet even a modest increase in warmth can alter the behavior of oceans that cover most of a planet. Warm water holds less dissolved oxygen than cold water. As the seas continued warming, the ability of the ocean to store oxygen slowly declined. Currents that once moved freely across the globe began to weaken. Without strong circulation, oxygen from the surface could no longer travel efficiently into deeper layers of water. The oceans began losing their breath. In many regions, the upper layers of the sea still appeared alive and active. Fish continued swimming through the currents. Reef organisms built their intricate structures across shallow sea floors. From the surface, little seemed wrong, but deeper below, something troubling was unfolding. The oxygen that marine animals depended on was gradually disappearing. Creatures living in these depths had evolved over millions of years in stable, oxygen-rich environments. Now the water surrounding them was slowly becoming difficult to breathe. Many species struggled to survive in conditions their bodies had never encountered before. As oxygen levels dropped, entire communities of marine life began weakening. At the same time, the chemical composition of the oceans was also beginning to change. Carbon dioxide released by the volcanic eruptions did not remain only in the air. Large amounts dissolved directly into seawater. When carbon dioxide mixes with ocean water, it forms weak acids that gradually alter the chemistry of the sea. This process, though invisible, has powerful consequences. Marine organisms that build shells or skeletal structures rely on stable chemical conditions to produce the minerals they need. As ocean acidity increased, many of these organisms found it increasingly difficult to maintain their protective shells. Reef systems that had supported thriving ecosystems for millions of years began weakening. Some reefs stopped growing altogether. Others slowly crumbled as the organisms that built them struggled to survive in the changing water. The oceans were becoming unstable in ways few creatures could escape. Yet the most dangerous transformation was still hidden in the deeper waters. As oxygen vanished from large areas of the ocean, a different kind of life began to spread. Certain microbes thrive in environments where oxygen is absent. These organisms had always existed in small pockets of the sea, confined to regions where normal marine life could not survive. No, their habitat was expanding. These microbes fed on organic material sinking from above, and in the process they released a gas known as hydrogen sulfide. The substance is highly toxic. Even small concentrations can poison animals that rely on oxygen to breathe. As oxygen-starved zones expanded across the oceans, hydrogen sulfide began accumulating in deeper waters. In some places, the gas slowly rose toward the surface. The seas that had once supported an astonishing diversity of life were becoming hostile environments. Marine creatures struggled to find oxygen. Reef ecosystems collapsed. Toxic gases spread silently through waters that had once been full of life. And while much of this transformation remained hidden beneath the waves, the consequences were about to reach far beyond the oceans, because once the systems supporting life begin to fail, collapse rarely stays contained in one place. Across the planet, ecosystems were approaching a breaking point. Life on Earth does not exist in isolation. Every forest, every reef, every riverbank depends on a delicate web of relationships that connect countless organisms together. Plants feed herbivores. Herbivores sustain predators. Tiny microorganisms recycle nutrients that allow ecosystems to continue functioning. Remove even a few threads from this web, and the entire structure begins to weaken. During the late Permian crisis, those threads began snapping one by one. The oceans were among the first places where the damage became impossible to ignore. Reef ecosystems that had flourished for millions of years began disappearing from the fossil record. The organisms that built these reefs could no longer survive in warming, acidic, oxygen-poor waters. As the reefs collapsed, the complex habitats they provided vanished with them. Thousands of species depended on those reefs for shelter and food. Without them, entire communities of marine life suddenly found themselves without protection or nourishment. Small organisms disappeared first. Creatures that grazed along the reef surfaces or hid within coral-like structures began dying off as their environment deteriorated. Predators soon followed. Fish and cephalopods that once hunted among thriving reef systems found fewer and fewer prey to sustain them. With each disappearing species, the chain reaction spread further through the ecosystem. In some regions of the ocean, entire food webs collapsed almost simultaneously. Seafloors that had once been crowded with life became strangely empty. The slow movements of trilobites faded from the fossil record. Brachiopods that had filtered nutrients from the sea for hundreds of millions of years vanished from many environments. Even resilient marine predators began struggling to find enough food to survive. The oceans were losing the intricate balance that had supported life for ages. On land, the changes unfolded in a different but equally devastating way. Rising global temperatures and shifting rainfall patterns placed enormous pressure on plant communities. Forests that had thrived under stable climates now faced prolonged droughts, extreme heat, and unpredictable seasons. Some regions grew too dry to support dense vegetation, plants weakened, and in many areas entire forests began thinning or disappearing altogether. Without stable plant life, herbivores found themselves in an increasingly hostile environment. Creatures that depended on lush vegetation for survival struggled to find food. Populations declined as animals wandered farther in search of resources that were becoming scarce. Many species simply could not adapt quickly enough to the rapidly changing world around them. Predators soon felt the consequences. As herbivore populations shrank, carnivorous animals lost the prey they relied upon. The chain reaction moved through terrestrial ecosystems just as it had through the oceans. Food chains that had once supported stable communities began unraveling with startling speed. From a human perspective, tens of thousands of years might sound like an immense stretch of time. But in geological terms, the collapse happened with shocking rapidity. Entire ecosystems disappeared within what scientists describe as a geological heartbeat. The fossil record reveals the scale of the catastrophe with haunting clarity. Layer after layer of rock shows the sudden disappearance of species that had dominated Earth's environments for hundreds of millions of years. In the oceans, more than 90% of marine species vanished. On land, nearly 70% of terrestrial animals disappeared as ecosystems crumbled around them. Few events in Earth's history have approached this level of devastation. It was not simply another extinction. It was the most severe biological crisis the planet had ever experienced. Scientists would later give it a name that reflected the enormity of the loss: the Great Dying. For a brief moment in Earth's long history, life itself seemed to be slipping toward collapse. Ecosystems across the planet had failed, and only scattered survivors remained within environments that had grown increasingly hostile. And yet the story was not over, because even in the darkest moments of this catastrophe, a small number of species endured. For most of Earth's history, the atmosphere has worked quietly in the background, an invisible partner to life. It carries oxygen for animals to breathe, carbon dioxide for plants to transform into energy, and moisture that feeds forests and oceans alike. The balance between these gases is delicate, but for millions of years it remained remarkably stable. During the late Permian, however, that balance began to shift. Far to the north, the eruptions across Siberia continued without pause. Rivers of lava still spilled across the land, but the most powerful effect of these eruptions was no longer confined to the ground. Each pulse of molten rock released enormous volumes of gas trapped deep within the planet. Carbon dioxide rose into the sky in quantities that had rarely entered the atmosphere before. Methane followed. Sulfur compounds drifted upward as well, carried by hot plumes that climbed high into the atmosphere before spreading across the globe. These gases changed something fundamental about the air surrounding the planet. Carbon dioxide acts like a blanket around the Earth. It allows sunlight to reach the surface but traps heat that would normally escape back into space. As the concentration of this gas increased, the planet began retaining more warmth with every passing year. Temperatures climbed slowly at first, but over time the warming became impossible for ecosystems to ignore. Across the tropical regions of Pangea, the heat grew increasingly intense. Forests that had thrived under warm but stable climates now faced temperatures far beyond what many species could tolerate. In the vast interior of the supercontinent, deserts expanded as rainfall patterns shifted and moisture became scarce. The land baked beneath the relentless sun. Seasonal extremes grew sharper. Summers brought scorching heat that withered vegetation and dried rivers. Winters offered little relief as the atmosphere held on to warmth that once dissipated naturally. Even regions near the poles began experiencing conditions that would once have been unimaginable. Ice disappeared from landscapes that had once known cooler climates. Warm winds carried heat across latitudes that had rarely felt such temperatures before. The planet was warming everywhere. Yet the rising heat was only part of the atmospheric transformation. As volcanic gases continued pouring into the sky, the chemical composition of the air itself began to change. Carbon dioxide levels climbed steadily higher, while oxygen, the gas that animals depend upon for survival, slowly declined. The shift was gradual, but deeply consequential. Many creatures had evolved in an atmosphere rich in oxygen, a condition that allowed large animals to move, hunt, and survive in demanding environments. As oxygen concentrations dropped, breathing became more difficult for those species. Large-bodied animals were especially vulnerable. Their size required greater amounts of oxygen to sustain muscles and organs. In a world where the air contained less of it, these creatures found themselves struggling to maintain the same levels of activity that had once been effortless. The stress spread quietly through ecosystems. Animals grew weaker. Some species became less capable of traveling long distances in search of food or water. Others faced increasing difficulty surviving in environments that had grown hotter and more oxygen poor from the outside. The atmosphere still looked the same. The sky remained blue. Winds still crossed the plains. Clouds still gathered above forests and seas. Yet the invisible chemistry of the air was becoming unstable. The atmosphere that had supported complex life for millions of years was slowly turning into something unfamiliar, something less forgiving. And as the air continued warming and oxygen levels declined, the oceans, already under immense pressure, began reacting in ways that would push the crisis far beyond anything the land alone could reveal. As the atmosphere changed and the oceans warmed, another transformation began far below the surface of the sea, one that few creatures could escape and none could see coming. For most of Earth's history, the deep ocean had been a place of quiet stability. Cold water carried oxygen slowly downward from the surface, allowing marine life to survive even in the darker regions, far from sunlight. Creatures drifted through these depths or rested along the sea floor, sustained by the steady chemistry of the sea. But when global temperatures rose and ocean circulation weakened, that delicate system began to break apart. In many parts of the world, oxygen stopped reaching the deeper layers of the ocean. The waters that once carried life became still and stagnant. Creatures adapted to oxygen-rich environments suddenly found themselves trapped in waters that were slowly suffocating them. As marine animals struggled to survive, Another kind of life began to flourish. Hidden within the sediments of the seafloor were communities of microscopic organisms that thrived under conditions most animals could not endure. These bacteria had existed quietly for millions of years in small pockets where oxygen was scarce. Under normal conditions, they remained confined to isolated environments, unable to compete with the vast diversity of life in oxygenated waters. Now, the ocean was changing in their favor. As oxygen disappeared from larger and larger regions of the sea, these microbes began spreading into territories that had once been occupied by fish, shellfish, and countless other marine organisms. The chemistry of their survival was very different from that of most life. Instead of using oxygen to process energy, these bacteria relied on chemical reactions that produced a dangerous byproduct, hydrogen sulfide. The gas is unmistakable to anyone who has encountered it. Even small amounts carry the sharp scent of rotten eggs. But beyond its unpleasant smell lies something far more dangerous. Hydrogen sulfide is highly toxic. In low concentrations, it can poison animals that rely on oxygen to breathe. In larger amounts, it becomes lethal, disrupting cellular processes essential for survival. Normally, oxygenated seawater prevents hydrogen sulfide from accumulating in large quantities. The gas is quickly neutralized in environments where oxygen is abundant. But in the oxygen-starved depths of the Permian oceans, nothing remained to stop its spread. The bacteria multiplied. Layer after layer of stagnant water allowed hydrogen sulfide to build quietly within the sea. Over time, the gas began rising slowly toward the surface, carried upward by subtle movements within the water. In some regions, it may have reached the shallower layers of the ocean, where marine animals still attempted to survive. The results would have been devastating. Fish swimming through these waters would encounter invisible clouds of poison. Shellfish anchored to the seafloor could find themselves surrounded by toxic conditions from which they could not escape. But the danger did not necessarily stop at the surface of the sea. In extreme conditions, hydrogen sulfide can rise from the ocean into the atmosphere itself. As bubbles of the gas escaped from coastal waters or shallow seas, they may have drifted into the air above the planet's shorelines. Imagine standing near those ancient coasts. The sea, once a place of life and movement, would have carried a faint but unmistakable odor. Winds drifting inland could bring with them traces of a gas capable of poisoning animals that breathed it. In those moments, the ocean would not simply have been dangerous to swim in, it may have been dangerous to stand beside. Scientists studying the rock layers of this period have found chemical clues suggesting that such conditions may indeed have existed. Certain biomarkers preserved in ancient sediments hint at widespread populations of hydrogen sulfide producing bacteria. These traces suggest a chilling possibility. Parts of the ocean may have become vast reservoirs of toxic gas. If even a fraction of that poison escaped into the atmosphere, the consequences for life on land would have been profound. Because by this stage of the crisis, the planet was already under immense stress. The air was warming. Oxygen levels were declining. The oceans were suffocating. And if hydrogen sulfide had begun rising from the sea, the Earth itself may have been approaching a state where complex life struggled to survive almost anywhere. By this stage of the crisis, the Earth was no longer experiencing isolated disasters. The forces reshaping the planet had begun to interact with one another, forming a chain reaction that spread through every environment where life existed. Volcanic eruptions continued pouring greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. Global temperatures climbed higher with each passing generation. The oceans grew warmer and more stagnant. Oxygen vanished from vast regions of the sea, while toxic hydrogen sulfide may have drifted upward from the depths. Individually, any one of these changes would have placed enormous strain on ecosystems. Together, they created conditions unlike anything complex life had ever faced. The biosphere, Earth's thin layer of living systems, began approaching its limits. Scientists studying rock formations from the end of the Permian period have uncovered strange chemical signals preserved in ancient sediments. These layers contain unusual sulfur compounds and microbial markers that hint at widespread ocean stagnation and the presence of hydrogen sulfide, bacteria. Such evidence suggests that enormous regions of the ocean may have become hostile to most forms of life. The water itself could no longer sustain the creatures that had lived within it for millions of years. As oxygen disappeared and toxic conditions spread, marine ecosystems collapsed on a scale that is difficult to imagine. Species that had survived countless environmental changes across hundreds of millions of years suddenly vanished from the fossil record. Trilobites, one of the most recognizable creatures of ancient seas, disappeared entirely, ending a lineage that had endured since long before the first forests grew on land. Reef ecosystems, once among the richest habitats on the planet, were nearly erased. Without reefs to anchor marine communities, countless other organisms lost the environments they depended upon. Predators lost prey. Grazers lost food sources. Entire ecological networks disintegrated with astonishing speed. The devastation did not remain confined to the oceans. On land, forests that had once spread across wide regions of Pangea struggled under extreme heat and unstable climates. Vegetation declined across large areas as droughts intensified and seasonal patterns shifted unpredictably. As plant life weakened, animals that relied on those ecosystems began disappearing as well. Many herbivores could not adapt to the rapid changes in vegetation. Without them, predators soon followed. Landscapes that had once supported thriving ecosystems gradually emptied of life. The fossil record from this period reveals the scale of the loss with stark clarity. Layer after layer of rock shows the sudden disappearance of species that had once dominated their environments. In the oceans, between 90 and 96% of marine species vanished. On land, roughly 70% of terrestrial animals disappeared as ecosystems collapsed around them. Few events in Earth's history have approached this level of devastation. It was not merely an extinction event. It was a biological near-death experience for the entire planet. For a brief and terrifying moment in geological time, complex life stood on the edge of disappearance. Ecosystems had unraveled, the atmosphere was changing, and the oceans had become hostile environments for the creatures that once thrived within them. If the crisis had intensified just slightly further, the outcome might have been very different. There was a moment when life on Earth balanced on the thinnest possible line between survival and permanent silence. Yet somehow, against extraordinary odds, that silence never fully arrived. Amid the devastation, a small number of species endured. Scattered survivors persisted in environments harsh enough to eliminate nearly everything else. These organisms would inherit a world that had been almost completely emptied, and from their survival, the long process of rebuilding life on Earth would slowly begin. When the worst of the catastrophe finally passed, the Earth did not return to the vibrant world it had once been. The storms of extinction faded, the eruptions slowly weakened, and the most violent environmental changes began to settle. Yet what remained was not a renewed planet full of life. It was something quieter. The forests that once stretched across vast regions of Pangea had largely disappeared. Where dense vegetation had once filtered sunlight and supported countless animals, the land now lay exposed. Bare soils baked beneath a hot sky, and without the roots of plants to hold them in place, the ground eroded easily under wind and rain. Rivers ran thick with sediment, carrying enormous quantities of mud and debris toward the oceans. The waters that flowed across the continents were no longer gentle pathways through thriving ecosystems. Instead, they cut through empty landscapes where the sounds of animal life had grown rare. In many places the land looked wounded. The oceans, too, remained unsettled. Although volcanic activity had begun to decline, the effects of the crisis lingered within the seas. Oxygen levels in many regions remained dangerously low, and the chemical balance of the water had not yet returned to stability. Reef systems that once anchored marine ecosystems were gone. The underwater structures that had supported complex communities of fish, shellfish, and countless smaller organisms had vanished almost entirely. In their place stretched vast seafloors that held far fewer inhabitants than before. Where once thousands of species interacted in intricate networks of survival, the oceans were now dominated by only a handful of hardy organisms. These survivors, creatures of the Permian world. Instead, they were species capable of tolerating harsh and animals that could endure low oxygen fluctuating temperatures and stable food supplies. Many delicate organisms had disappeared on land. The pattern was similar. The diverse communities of amphibians, reptiles, and other animals that had once moved through Permian forests had largely vanished. Entire evolutionary groups were missing from the landscapes where they had once flourished. In their place were scattered populations of resilient species struggling to survive in an unpredictable world. The change in biodiversity was profound. For hundreds of millions of years, life on Earth had grown steadily more complex. Ecosystems had become layered with specialized organisms filling countless ecological roles. The Permian world had represented the peak of that complexity. Now much of it was gone. The early Triassic planet that followed the extinction contained far fewer species than the world that had existed before. Fossil records from this period reveal ecosystems that were astonishingly simple compared to earlier eras. Instead of diverse communities, many environments were dominated by only one or two species, capable of enduring the difficult conditions. Biological diversity had fallen to one of the lowest levels in the entire history of life on Earth. For millions of years, the planet existed in this reduced state. The air was still warm, the oceans were still unstable. Vegetation slowly attempted to return to barren landscapes, but recovery came gradually and unevenly across the continents. It was not a world of abundance, it was a world of endurance. Life had not vanished entirely, but it had been stripped down to a fragile foundation. The ecosystems that once filled forests and seas had collapsed into simpler forms, where survival depended less on specialization and more on resilience. The planet itself seemed to move more quietly through this period. After the Great Dying, Earth was not reborn immediately. It became strangely silent. And within that silence, a small group of unusual survivors continued adapting to the harsh conditions that had destroyed nearly everything else. In this altered world, survival required qualities that had rarely been important before. The creatures that possessed them would become the unexpected heirs of a devastated planet. When an extinction of such enormous scale passes across a planet, the creatures that remain are rarely the ones that once dominated it. The largest animals, the most specialized predators, and the species that seemed perfectly adapted to their environments often disappear first. What remains are the organisms that possess a quieter advantage. The ability to endure change. In the devastated world that followed the Great Dying, survival belonged not to the giants of the Permian age, but to smaller, more adaptable creatures that could tolerate conditions others could not. Many of these survivors lived close to the ground, hidden within environments where the planet's harsh surface conditions were softened. Some animals survived by burrowing into soil, where temperatures were more stable and the worst heat of the changing climate could be avoided. Underground shelters offered protection from drought and unpredictable weather. Within these narrow tunnels, small animals could escape the extreme swings in temperature that now defined the surface world. Other species endured by changing what they ate. Before the extinction, many creatures had depended on specific plants or prey. When those food sources vanished, specialized diets became a dangerous limitation. The animals that survived were often those capable of eating a wide variety of whatever remained. Flexible diets allowed them to adapt to an unstable world where familiar food chains had collapsed. In this harsh environment, resilience mattered more than strength. Among the survivors were groups of animals that had once lived in the background of Permian ecosystems. Early relatives of mammals, descendants of a group known as synapsids, continued moving quietly through the altered landscapes. These creatures were not yet the mammals we recognize today, but they carried traits that would one day shape the future of life on Earth. They were generally small and adaptable, capable of surviving in environments where larger animals struggled. Some may have been active during cooler parts of the day or night, avoiding the intense heat that now dominated the climate. Reptilian survivors also remained scattered across the recovering world. Some early reptiles possessed body plans well suited to harsh conditions. Their scaly skin helped prevent water loss in dry climates, and their ability to conserve energy allowed them to endure environments where food was scarce. None of these survivors would have appeared impressive to an observer comparing them to the powerful animals that once ruled the Permian world. But they possessed something far more valuable. They were capable of adapting. In the quiet aftermath of the extinction, these modest creatures began slowly spreading across landscapes that had been nearly emptied of life. Without large predators dominating the land, new opportunities emerged for animals capable of surviving in the difficult conditions. The process was slow. Generations passed as these species adjusted to the altered world around them. Some populations expanded into territories that had once been crowded with other animals. Others evolved new behaviors that allowed them to exploit resources that earlier species had ignored. Little by little, life began to reclaim the planet. The ecosystems that formed during this time were far simpler than those that existed before the extinction, yet they carried within them the seeds of something remarkable. From these scattered survivors, new evolutionary stories would begin. The creatures that inherited the Earth were not the giants of their time. They were the quiet survivors, and although the planet had begun the long journey toward recovery, the rebuilding of life would unfold at a pace far slower than anyone might expect. Because when an extinction removes nearly everything, restoring the richness of life takes far longer than the destruction itself. From a planetary disaster does not happen in a single season, or even in 1,000 years. When the Great Dying passed across Earth, it left behind a biosphere so deeply damaged that rebuilding life would require immense stretches of time. First, the planet remained quiet. For millions of years after the extinction, biodiversity stayed remarkably low. Fossil records from the early Triassic period reveal ecosystems that appear strangely simple when compared to the rich environments that existed before the collapse. In many places, only a small number of species dominated entire landscapes. Instead of forests filled with diverse plants and animals, certain regions were occupied by only a few hardy organisms that had proven capable of surviving the harsh climate. These survivors reproduced and spread into empty territories, but the variety of life remained limited. The oceans told a similar story. Where once reefs had formed vibrant underwater cities filled with fish, shellfish, and countless other marine creatures, the early Triassic seas held far fewer inhabitants. Without stable reef systems, many marine species lacked the habitats they needed to thrive. Large areas of the seafloor remained sparsely populated. It would take an extraordinary length of time for the oceans to recover from the loss of so many species. Yet slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the rebuilding of life began. As volcanic activity declined and the atmosphere gradually stabilized, conditions across the planet began improving. Oxygen levels in the oceans started rising again, allowing marine organisms to return to environments that had once been suffocating. New reef-building organisms appeared, different from those that had dominated before the extinction. These early reef systems were smaller and simpler, but they marked the first signs that complex marine ecosystems were beginning to return. Fish populations slowly increased as food chains reformed. On-land vegetation spread gradually across landscapes that had once been stripped bare. Plants stabilized soils that had eroded during the harshest years of the extinction. As forests and wetlands slowly returned, they created habitats for animals that had survived the crisis. Among those animals were lineages that would shape the next chapter of life on Earth. Reptile groups began diversifying into new forms, experimenting with body shapes and behaviors that had not existed before. Some evolved into swift predators capable of running across open terrain. Others adapted to herbivorous lifestyles, feeding on the recovering vegetation. Within these evolving reptile lineages lay the distant ancestors of dinosaurs. Meanwhile, the small mammal-like reptiles that survived the extinction continued their own quiet evolution. These early relatives of mammals adapted to the recovering world in ways that would eventually lead to entirely new forms of life. The rebuilding of ecosystems unfolded slowly, generation by generation. Millions of years passed before biodiversity began approaching the levels that had existed before the extinction. Even then, the world that emerged was fundamentally different from the Permian planet that had vanished. Entire evolutionary lineages were gone forever. The ecosystems that replaced them followed new paths shaped by the survivors of the catastrophe. In this way, the Great Dying did more than destroy life. It redirected the future of evolution. Without that extinction, the rise of dinosaurs might never have occurred. The later dominance of mammals might have unfolded along a completely different path. Even the distant origins of humanity are connected to the environmental reset that occurred during this ancient crisis. The greatest extinction in Earth's history did not end the story of life. It rewrote it. From the ashes of a devastated biosphere, a new world slowly began to form, one shaped by resilience, adaptation, and the unexpected survivors who inherited a changed planet. And as those survivors spread across land and sea, evolution began exploring possibilities that had never existed before. When the great wave of extinction finally passed, the worst of the devastation seemed to be over. The eruptions slowed. The skies cleared in places where ash had once drifted endlessly across the horizon. The violent environmental collapse that had erased so much life began to fade into the planet's geological past. Yet the Earth did not return to normal. Instead, the world entered a long and unsettling aftermath, an era when the damage left by the Great Dying refused to fully heal. For millions of years, the planet struggled to regain the balance it had once held so easily. The early Triassic world remained harsh and unstable. The atmosphere still carried the lingering effects of the massive volcanic eruptions that had triggered the catastrophe. Enormous quantities of greenhouse gases remained trapped in the air, holding heat close to the planet's surface. Temperatures across much of the Earth stayed unusually high. Regions that had once supported rich forests were now dry and hostile landscapes. Without dense vegetation to stabilize the soil, the land eroded quickly beneath wind and seasonal storms. The ground itself seemed exhausted, stripped of the ecosystems that had once flourished there. Across the interior of Pangea, vast stretches of terrain had become deserts. Where rivers once flowed through forests and wetlands, many waterways now carried heavy loads of sediment eroded from barren hillsides. Thick mud washed downstream into the oceans, clouding coastal waters and burying habitats that marine organisms had once relied upon. Even where plants began slowly returning to the land, their recovery was uneven and fragile. Vegetation grew in scattered patches rather than the dense forests that had once covered the continents. The ecosystems rebuilding themselves during this time were thin and vulnerable, easily disrupted by changes in climate. The oceans were no more stable. Although the most extreme volcanic activity had begun to fade, the seas still struggled to recover from the profound disruptions that had occurred during the extinction. Oxygen levels in many marine environments remained dangerously low, preventing the return of complex marine ecosystems. Without oxygen-rich waters, many species simply could not survive. The fossil record from this period reveals seas that were strangely empty compared to earlier ages. Instead of thriving communities filled with diverse organisms, many marine environments were dominated by only a few hardy species capable of tolerating the difficult conditions. Entire regions of the ocean floor held little life at all. For creatures that had survived the extinction, the world remained an uncertain place. Food chains were still fragile. Habitats that once supported complex ecosystems had not yet returned. Many species lived on the edge of survival, adapting to environments that remained far harsher than those their ancestors had known. Life had endured the extinction, but only barely. The Great Dying had not passed like a storm that destroys and then quickly fades away. Instead, it left the planet trapped within a prolonged ecological crisis, a period when recovery moved slowly and unpredictably. Millions of years passed before ecosystems began showing clear signs of stability again. During this long struggle, the Earth remained a world of extremes. Temperatures fluctuated. Oceans remained unstable. Life persisted, but often in simplified communities dominated by species that could tolerate harsh conditions. Yet within this difficult environment, powerful evolutionary forces were quietly at work. The creatures that survived were adapting in ways that would eventually reshape the future of life on Earth. Under the pressure of extreme conditions, new traits began emerging, traits that allowed certain animals to thrive where others could not, and from those adaptations entirely new forms of life would soon begin to appear. In the long aftermath of the Great Dying, the planet did not return to the stable ecosystems that had once supported such extraordinary diversity. Instead, life was forced to continue within an environment that remained difficult, unpredictable, and often hostile. For the species that had survived, existence became a constant test of adaptation. The early Triassic world rewarded creatures capable of enduring extremes. Temperatures remained high across much of the planet, rainfall was irregular, and food sources appeared and vanished with little warning. Animals that depended on narrow diets or specific habitats often struggled to persist in these conditions, but others found ways to adjust. Many of the survivors were small and mobile, able to travel across large areas in search of food and water. Their bodies required fewer resources to sustain themselves, allowing them to survive in ecosystems where energy was scarce. Flexibility became one of the most valuable traits in this recovering world. Some animals adapted to shifting climates by becoming more active during cooler parts of the day. Others developed broader diets, feeding on whatever plants or small animals they could find. In a world stripped of stability, survival belonged to those that could change. Among these adaptable survivors were early reptilian groups that once lived quietly within Permian ecosystems. These reptiles were not yet the dominant creatures they would one day become. In fact, during the early Triassic, they represented only a small portion of the planet's animal life. But they possessed features that would prove valuable in the harsh new environment. These animals belonged to a group known as archosaurs. At the time, archosaurs were simply one of several reptile lineages competing for survival. Many looked modest and unremarkable compared to the powerful animals that had dominated the Permian world. Yet their body structures that would slowly become important. Their limbs were positioned more directly beneath their bodies, allowing them to move efficiently across land, rather than sprawling close to the ground, like many earlier reptiles. This posture made traveling long distances easier, an important trait in landscapes where resources were scattered, an important trait. Their respiratory systems may also have allowed them to function more effectively in environments where oxygen levels were lower than they had once been. These advantages did not immediately make archosaurs dominant. They were simply one group among many struggling to survive. Meanwhile, the descendants of earlier synapsids, the mammal-like reptiles that had once flourished before the extinction, continued facing their own challenges. Many of these creatures had suffered greatly during the environmental collapse. The ecosystems they once inhabited had changed dramatically, yet some endured. These animals carried traits that would eventually lead to mammals millions of years later. During the early Triassic, however, they remained small and vulnerable, navigating a world that had become far harsher than the one their ancestors had known. The planet had become an evolutionary testing ground. After an extinction removes the majority of life, ecosystems are left with countless empty roles waiting to be filled. Predators, herbivores, scavengers, and countless other ecological niches suddenly stand open. In such moments, evolution begins experimenting again. Small populations of survivors slowly branch into different forms as they adapt to the changing world. The creatures that eventually come to dominate the planet are rarely the same ones that ruled before the disaster. In the ruins of the old world, evolution began quietly exploring new possibilities. Over time, these experiments would lead to some of the most extraordinary animals the Earth had ever seen. But while life on land was slowly transforming, another equally important recovery was beginning far below the waves. Because the oceans, too, were preparing to rebuild from the near-total collapse that had once emptied their depths. For a long time after the Great Dying, the oceans remained quiet in a way they had never been before. Vast stretches of water that once supported intricate webs of marine life held only a few scattered survivors, drifting through unstable currents. But the Earth was slowly changing again. As volcanic activity declined and the immense eruptions that reshaped the planet finally began to fade, the atmosphere gradually started returning toward balance. Temperatures remained warm, yet the relentless surge of greenhouse gases that had once pushed the climate to extremes was weakening. These changes allowed the oceans to begin a slow recovery. Water circulation, which had once stalled during the worst phases of the crisis, started moving again. Currents carried oxygen from the surface back into deeper regions of the sea. In places that had once been suffocating for marine life, conditions slowly improved. The transformation was subtle. For millions of years, the oceans had existed in a simplified state dominated by a few resilient species capable of enduring the difficult environment. Now, new organisms began appearing in the fossil record, hinting that marine ecosystems were cautiously rebuilding themselves. Small communities of reef-building organisms returned first. These early reef structures were different from the vast coral-like ecosystems that had flourished before the extinction. They were smaller and less complex, built by organisms experimenting with ways to survive in waters that were only beginning to stabilize. Yet even these modest reefs created something the oceans desperately needed: habitat. Within the protective structures formed by these organisms, other marine creatures found shelter and resources that allowed them to expand once again. Small fish moved through the growing reef systems. Shell-bearing animals anchored themselves to rocky surfaces. Gradually, these environments began supporting larger and more diverse populations of life. Predator and prey relationships slowly reappeared. Fish that hunted smaller organisms began spreading through the recovering seas. In turn, other animals adapted to evade those predators or exploit new food sources within the changing ecosystem. The oceans were becoming active again. Yet the marine world emerging from the extinction was not a simple restoration of what had been lost. Entire groups of animals that once dominated the seas were gone forever. Trilobites, which had existed for hundreds of millions of years, never returned. Many reef-building species that once constructed vast underwater ecosystems had vanished permanently. The creatures that replaced them belonged to different evolutionary lineages. In their place appeared new organisms experimenting with roles that earlier species had once filled. Fish populations diversified into unfamiliar forms. New predators appeared, and unfamiliar prey adapted to survive alongside them. The oceans were healing, but they were becoming something different. Extinction events do not merely pause the story of life and then allow it to continue unchanged. When such vast numbers of species disappear, the evolutionary pathways that follow rarely resemble those that existed before. The Great Dying had removed entire chapters from the history of life. What followed was not a continuation of the old story, but the beginning of a new one. The seas slowly regained movement and diversity, yet the ecosystems taking shape beneath the waves were built from different foundations. New species replaced those that vanished. New interactions formed between creatures that never before shared the same environment. The oceans were coming back to life, but they were no longer the same oceans. And as these recovering ecosystems continued expanding across the planet, the stage was being prepared for another transformation. Because the survivors of the Great Dying were not simply rebuilding the world that had been lost, they were creating the conditions for entirely new dynasties of life to emerge. When they crossed the planet, it removed far more than individual species. Entire ecological systems vanished with them. Predators disappeared from landscapes. They had ruled for millions of years. And reef builders that had shaped underwater habits were gone. Herbivores that once moved through forests in great numbers left behind slent. What remained was something unusual in the long history of life. The world was suddenly full of empty roles. Every ecosystem depends on balance. There are animals that graze on plants, creatures that hunt those herbivores, scavengers that recycle the remains, and countless smaller organisms that sustain the entire system from below. Each of these roles must exist for the machinery of life to function properly. When the Great Dying erased most species from the planet, many of those roles were left unfilled. It was as if the stage of evolution had been cleared. The creatures that survived now faced a world with vast opportunities. Landscapes once crowded with competing species had become open territory. Food sources that had once been fought over were suddenly available to whichever animals could exploit them. This moment created one of the most powerful forces in evolutionary history, when many ecological niches become empty at the same time. Surviving organisms begin to diversify rapidly. Over generations, populations adapt to new environments and new food sources. Small differences in behavior or body structure can give certain individuals advantages, allowing them to spread into roles that were once occupied by other species. Scientists call this process adaptive radiation. In the recovering world of the early Triassic, adaptive radiation was quietly reshaping life across the planet. Reptilian groups that had once lived in the shadows of larger animals began evolving into entirely new forms. Some developed longer legs and lighter bodies, allowing them to move swiftly across open landscapes that had once been thick forests. Others evolved stronger jaws and sharper teeth, suited for hunting prey in environments where predators were now scarce. Certain species adapted to feed on plants that had returned to the recovering land, developing teeth and digestive systems capable of processing tough vegetation. The changes did not happen all at once. Instead, generation by generation, populations experimented with new possibilities. Slight variations in anatomy or behavior spread through groups that found themselves occupying roles no other species yet filled. The planet was becoming a laboratory of evolutionary innovation. Life was no longer simply rebuilding the ecosystems that had been destroyed. It was creating entirely new ones, shaped by the survivors of the catastrophe, rather than the species that had vanished. The creatures emerging during this period were not replicas of those that had ruled the Permian world. They belonged to different evolutionary branches, carrying traits that would lead life in directions never before explored. In this sense, the extinction did more than destroy life. It reshaped the future of evolution itself. The disappearance of so many dominant species had created a vacuum that evolution was now rushing to fill. Across land and sea, new animals appeared with unfamiliar body plans and behaviors that allowed them to thrive in the altered world. Among these evolving groups were reptiles that would eventually become some of the most remarkable creatures the planet had ever seen. At first they were small and scattered, hardly noticeable among the many survivors adapting to the recovering ecosystems, but within their anatomy lay features that would soon give them an advantage, because somewhere within this quiet evolutionary experiment, the early ancestors of dinosaurs were beginning to appear. And in the centuries of time that followed, they would rise to occupy the empty throne left behind by the extinction. In the uncertain world that followed the Great Dying, many different reptile groups struggled to reclaim the empty landscapes of the early Triassic. The extinction had cleared away countless species, but it had not chosen a single successor to inherit the Earth. Instead, several lineages of survivors competed within the same fragile ecosystems, each adapting in its own way to the changed planet. Among them were a group of reptiles that at the time seemed unremarkable. These animals were the early archosaurs. They were not the largest creatures roaming the recovering continents, nor were they the most numerous. In many environments they shared the land with other reptilian groups that had also survived the extinction, each exploring new opportunities in the emptied ecosystems. Yet within the bodies of these archosaurs were subtle advantages that would slowly shape the future of life. One of their most important features lay in the way their limbs connected to their bodies. Many earlier reptiles moved with a sprawling posture, their legs extending outward from the sides of their bodies. This stance worked well in stable environments, but required considerable energy to maintain movement over long distances. Archosaurs were different. Their limbs were positioned more directly beneath their bodies, allowing them to stand and move with greater efficiency. This posture allowed them to walk, run, and travel across landscapes using less energy than many of their competitors. In a world where resources were scattered and ecosystems remained unstable, efficiency mattered. Archosaurs could move farther in search of food, water, or territory. Their respiratory systems may have also offered advantages. Some evidence suggests that early archosaurs possessed breathing mechanisms capable of exchanging oxygen more effectively than many other reptiles. In an atmosphere that still carried the lingering effects of the extinction, where oxygen levels had not fully returned to earlier concentrations, this ability could make the difference between survival and exhaustion. These advantages did not immediately place archosaurs at the top of the food chain. At first they were simply one group among many exploring the new opportunities created by the extinction. But as generations passed, those subtle traits began shaping the way archosaurs adapted to the recovering world. Some lineages moved toward water. Over time, certain archosaurs developed bodies suited for life along rivers and coastal environments. Their descendants would eventually give rise to the ancestors of modern crocodiles, animals capable of thriving both on land and in water. Other archosaurs remained on land and began evolving into swift predators. Their upright posture and efficient movement allowed them to chase prey across open landscapes that had once been forests, but were now vast plains and dry valleys. In these environments, speed and endurance were powerful advantages. Gradually, archosaurs diversified into a growing range of forms, each adapting to different ecological roles across the planet. The process unfolded slowly, almost invisibly within the long sweep of geological time. Millions of years passed as these reptiles expanded into new environments, refining traits that allowed them to survive in the changing world. During this time, they remained only one part of the planet's evolving ecosystems. Yet within this expanding group lay a lineage that would soon transform the history of life. From among the archosaurs emerged a branch of animals that would become something extraordinary. They would grow larger, faster, and more diverse than any land animals before them. Their descendants would dominate forests, plains, and coastal regions across the globe. These were the earliest ancestors of the dinosaurs. The animals that would one day rule the Earth began as small survivors in a devastated world. But before that rise could fully unfold, The planet itself needed time to stabilize, because evolution can only flourish when the environment supporting it finally finds its balance again. The recovery of Earth did not happen in a single dramatic moment. It unfolded slowly across immense stretches of time, so gradually that no creature living through it could have recognized the change as it happened. Millions of years passed after the Great Dying before the planet began approaching something resembling stability again. The great eruptions that had poured lava across Siberia finally faded into silence. Without constant waves of volcanic gases entering the atmosphere, the planet's climate began adjusting. Carbon dioxide levels slowly declined, allowing some of the trapped heat to escape back into space. Temperatures that had once pushed ecosystems toward collapse gradually softened. The transformation was not sudden. The world remained warm for a long time, but the relentless extremes began easing. Rainfall patterns became more predictable. Seasons regained a rhythm that plants and animals could once again depend upon. With these changes, vegetation slowly returned to landscapes that had once been stripped bare. Across the continents, plants began spreading across soils that had eroded for millions of years. Early forests formed in scattered patches at first, their roots stabilizing the land and allowing ecosystems to rebuild from the ground up. Where trees and vegetation grew, animal life soon followed. Herbivores moved through these recovering habitats, feeding on plants that adapted to the warmer climate. Predators appeared as well, drawn by the return of prey to regions that had once been nearly empty. Gradually, ecosystems began regaining the complexity they had lost. The oceans followed a similar path. With volcanic activity fading and atmospheric conditions stabilizing, ocean circulation strengthened again. Currents carried oxygen deeper into the seas, allowing marine environments that had once been suffocating to support life once more. New reef systems appeared across the seafloor, built by organisms different from those that had dominated the Permian oceans. Within these growing reefs, marine life flourished. Fish diversified into new forms. Shell-bearing animals expanded across recovering habitats. Predator and prey relationships grew more intricate as ecosystems layered themselves into complex networks once again. The seas were alive with movement and interaction. Yet the marine world that emerged from this recovery did not resemble the one that had existed before the extinction. Entire evolutionary groups had vanished forever. Trilobites, once among the most recognizable creatures of ancient oceans, were gone. Many reef-building organisms that had shaped marine ecosystems for hundreds of millions of years had disappeared completely. In their place were new lineages exploring roles that earlier species had once filled. The same pattern appeared on land. Reptiles that had survived the extinction diversified into unfamiliar forms. Archosaurs continued spreading across continents, their descendants evolving into animals that would soon dominate the world. Meanwhile, the ancestors of mammals persisted quietly, adapting to environments that were slowly becoming more hospitable again. The rebuilding of ecosystems had succeeded. Life had survived its greatest crisis. But the world that emerged from the recovery was fundamentally different from the Permian planet that had once existed. The extinction had permanently altered the direction of evolution. Entire branches of life's long history had been erased. In their place, new evolutionary experiments were unfolding. Experiments that would eventually lead to the rise of dinosaurs, the diversification of mammals, and the complex ecosystems that would shape the modern world. The planet had recovered. Yet it was no longer the same world that had nearly died. Earth had endured its greatest catastrophe, but the story of life had been rewritten in ways that would echo through the next hundreds of millions of years, and those echoes still shape the living world today. For most of human history, the story of the Great Dying remained completely unknown. The creatures that vanished during that ancient catastrophe disappeared long before the first human walked the earth. No written record described their world, and no witness remained to tell what had happened. Yet the evidence was never truly lost. It had simply been buried. Across deserts, mountains, and distant coastlines around the world, the earth preserves its past within layers of stone. These layers form slowly as sediment settles over time, sand carried by rivers, mud drifting across ocean floors, volcanic ash falling quietly through ancient skies. Each layer becomes a page in the planet's long geological record. Over millions of years, these sediments harden into rock, sealing within them the fossils, minerals, and chemical traces of the environment that existed when they were formed. Creatures that lived in those ancient ecosystems leave behind shells, bones, or subtle impressions in the stone. To the trained eye, these layers become a timeline of life itself. Geologists have spent centuries studying these rock records, slowly learning how to read the history written within them. By examining fossils preserved in different layers, scientists can reconstruct entire ecosystems that vanished long ago. But sometimes the story hidden within the rocks contains something far more unsettling. In many parts of the world, researchers studying rock layers from the end of the Permian period began noticing a strange and consistent pattern. Older layers, the rocks were crowded with fossils. Shells of marine animals appeared in abundance. The remains of countless organisms filled the stone, evidence of thriving ecosystems that had once existed in those ancient seas. Then quite suddenly everything changed. Above those fossil-rich layers appeared new strata where life seemed to vanish almost entirely. Instead of diverse collections of fossils, these rocks contained very few remains at all. Species that had appeared repeatedly in earlier layers were suddenly gone. Entire groups of organisms disappeared at the same boundary. This pattern appeared not in just one location, but across many regions of the planet. From remote mountain ranges to exposed cliffs along ancient seabeds, the same geological transition appeared again and again. A world filled with life, followed by a world that seemed nearly empty. For scientists, such patterns demand explanation. At first, the disappearance puzzled researchers. Local environmental changes could explain isolated extinctions, but the fossil record suggested something far larger. The sudden drop in biodiversity appeared across vast distances, affecting oceans and continents alike. It hinted at a catastrophe that had unfolded on a global scale. Further investigation revealed that these layers corresponded to a moment roughly 252 million years ago, marking the boundary between the Permian and Triassic periods of Earth's history. At that boundary, the fossil record showed the greatest loss of biodiversity ever discovered. The rocks themselves had preserved the evidence. Species that had dominated ecosystems for hundreds of millions of years vanished within a narrow geological interval. The transition was so abrupt that it suggested a disaster, unfolding over a relatively short span of time. In geological terms, it happened almost instantly. This discovery marked one of the first major clues that Earth had once experienced an extinction event far more severe than anything previously imagined. The evidence lay silent within the rocks, waiting for millions of years until someone finally learned how to read it. But while fossils revealed the scale of the catastrophe, they could not explain its cause. To understand what truly happened during the Great Dying, scientists would need to look deeper into the stone itself, searching not only for bones and shells, but for chemical fingerprints left behind by a planet in crisis. Fossils can tell us which creatures vanished during the Great Dying, but they cannot fully explain why it happened. A shell embedded in stone can reveal the presence of a species, yet it cannot describe the invisible forces that shape the environment in which that creature once lived. To uncover those hidden details, scientists turned to something even more subtle than fossils. They began studying the chemistry locked within the rocks themselves. Every layer of sediment preserves more than bones and shells. Within its minerals are tiny traces of the atmosphere and oceans that existed when the sediment first formed. These chemical signatures act like fingerprints, capturing changes in the planet's environment that occurred millions of years ago. When researchers began analyzing rock layers from the end of the Permian period, they discovered something remarkable. The chemistry of the Earth appeared to change dramatically at exactly the same moment that so many species disappeared. One of the most important clues came from carbon isotopes. Carbon exists in slightly different forms, known as isotopes, which behave almost identically in chemical reactions, but can be measured with extraordinary precision. Living organisms tend to prefer one form of carbon over another, leaving a distinct signature in organic matter and sediments. When scientists examined carbon isotopes preserved in Permian rock layers, they found a sudden and dramatic shift. Such a change suggested that enormous amounts of carbon had entered the atmosphere and oceans in a relatively short period of time. The disturbance was far too large to be explained by normal geological processes. Something had released vast quantities of greenhouse gases into the planet's systems. Other chemical evidence pointed toward equally troubling conditions in the oceans. Certain minerals form only when seawater contains very little oxygen. When researchers examined marine sediments from the extinction boundary, They found widespread deposits of these minerals scattered across ancient seafloors. This discovery suggested that enormous regions of the ocean had become anoxic environments where oxygen was almost completely absent. For marine organisms that depend on oxygen to survive, such conditions would have been devastating. The rocks also contain microscopic traces of bacteria that thrive in oxygen-starved environments. These microbes are known to produce hydrogen sulfide as a byproduct of their metabolism. When scientists discovered biomarkers associated with these bacteria, preserved within late Permian sediments, it raised a chilling possibility. Parts of the ocean may have become filled with hydrogen sulfide. In large enough quantities, this toxic gas can poison marine ecosystems and even escape into the atmosphere, threatening life on land as well. The chemical clues embedded within the rocks began forming a coherent picture. The planet had not simply experienced a single disaster. Instead, Earth's environmental systems appeared to have failed together. Greenhouse gases flooded the atmosphere, warming the climate. The warming disrupted ocean circulation, causing oxygen levels to collapse in large areas of the sea. In the absence of oxygen, toxic bacteria flourished, releasing gases that may have spread through marine environments and beyond. Each discovery added another piece to a complex and unsettling puzzle. The Great Dying was not the result of one isolated event. It was a chain reaction of planetary changes, each triggering the next until ecosystems across the globe began collapsing. The rocks had preserved more than fossils of extinct animals. They had captured the chemical echoes of a planet in crisis. Yet, even with this growing body of evidence, one crucial question remained unanswered. If the extinction was driven by such a massive disruption to Earth's climate and oceans, what event had been powerful enough to trigger the entire chain reaction in the first place? To find that answer, scientists would need to look once again toward a region of the planet where the ground itself had once begun to break apart. As scientists continued piecing together the clues hidden in the rock record, one location on Earth began drawing increasing attention. Far across the northern regions of Asia lay a vast landscape of dark stone that seemed strangely out of place. The terrain stretched for enormous distances, formed by thick layers of hardened lava stacked one upon another, like giant steps across the land. This region is known today as the Siberian Traps. At first glance, it might appear to be nothing more than an ancient volcanic field, but when geologists began studying the rock more closely, they realized they were looking at the remains of one of the most extraordinary volcanic events in the planet's history. The basalt layers covering Siberia had once been rivers of molten rock that flowed across the surface millions of years ago. Some of these lava flows were hundreds of kilometers long and dozens of meters thick. When scientists measured the total volume of these eruptions, the numbers were difficult to comprehend. The lava alone had buried an area larger than modern Western Europe. Yet the scale of the eruptions was not the most important discovery. Using advanced techniques that measure the decay of radioactive elements in rock, researchers were able to determine the age of the volcanic layers with remarkable precision. When those dates were compared with the timing of the Permian extinction recorded in sedimentary rocks around the world, eruptions occurred at almost exactly the same time. This coincidence immediately raised a critical question. Cold eruptions have triggered the extinction itself. The more scientists, Siberian. These eruptions were not ordinary volcanic events that lasted a few years or decades. They continued in pulses for hundreds of thousands of years, releasing enormous amounts of molten rock and volcanic gases into the atmosphere. Each eruption sent vast plumes of carbon dioxide, methane, and sulfur compounds skyward. Such gases are powerful drivers of climate change. Carbon dioxide traps heat in the atmosphere, while sulfur compounds can alter atmospheric chemistry in ways that affect rainfall and sunlight. The longer the eruptions continued, the more these gases accumulated. Eventually, the quantities released may have been large enough to dramatically alter the planet's climate system. Temperatures rose, ocean circulation weakened, and the chain reaction of environmental collapse began spreading across the Earth. But the eruptions may have triggered an even larger release of greenhouse gases than the lava alone could explain. Beneath the volcanic region lay enormous deposits of coal and organic-rich sediments formed from ancient forests and marine life. When magma forced its way through these layers underground, When magma forced its way through these nethenters, methane and carbon dioxide, into the atmosphere to effect, the eruptions may have ignited a second wave of greenhouse gases. The combined result would have been a surge of atmospheric carbon far beyond what volcanoes alone typically produce. Over time, the evidence from geology, chemistry, and climate modeling began converging on the same conclusion. The Siberian Traps eruptions were not merely a coincidence in Earth's history. They were likely the trigger that set the Great Dying in motion. The rocks had pointed scientists toward a single region on the planet, one place where the ground itself may have unleashed a chain of events powerful enough to nearly erase life. What began as fissures in the Earth's crust may have ignited a planetary disaster. And once the environmental changes started spreading through the atmosphere and oceans, they proved almost impossible to stop. Yet this discovery raises an unsettling thought. If such a catastrophe once began with forces deep inside the Earth, could something similar ever happen again? To answer that question, scientists have begun looking not only at the distant past, but also at the fragile systems that shape the planet today. When we look at the Earth today, it is difficult to imagine a world on the brink of total biological collapse. The continents are scattered across the globe rather than joined together in a single supercontinent. Vast oceans separate them, circulating water and heat through powerful currents that help regulate the planet's climate. From space, the Earth appears balanced. Cloud systems drift across oceans and continents. Forests spread across tropical regions. Polar ice reflects sunlight back into space. The atmosphere maintains a delicate mixture of gases that allows life to breathe, grow, and flourish. Compared to the chaotic world of the late Permian, the modern planet seems remarkably stable. The arrangement of continents alone creates a very different climate system from the one that existed during the time of Pangea. Today's oceans move heat around the globe through complex circulation patterns, preventing the extreme temperature swings that once plagued the interior of the ancient supercontinent. Moist air travels across continents more easily, feeding forests and river systems that stabilize landscapes and support diverse ecosystems. Even the chemistry of the atmosphere has changed. The proportions of oxygen, carbon dioxide, and other gases differ significantly from those that existed during the Permian crisis. Over millions of years, Earth's natural cycles, weathering rocks, burying carbon in sediments, and growing forests, have gradually reshaped the composition of the air. Modern ecosystems are also structured in ways that differ from those ancient environments. Forests now host flowering plants and complex food webs that did not exist during the Permian period. Oceans are dominated by coral reefs, fish lineages, and marine organisms that evolved long after the extinction event reshaped life on the planet. At first glance, these differences might suggest that the Great Dying belongs entirely to a distant and unreachable past. It can feel as though such a catastrophe could never occur again. The conditions that existed 252 million years ago appear so unusual that they seem unlikely to repeat. The supercontinent Pangea no longer exists. The volcanic eruptions that formed the Siberian Traps were among the largest in Earth's history. Our planet today seems too different for the same disaster to unfold. Yet scientists who study Earth's past often approach such conclusions with caution. While the exact circumstances of the Permian extinction were unique, the underlying processes that drove the crisis are not limited to that moment in time. Rapid climate change, disruptions in ocean circulation, and shifts in atmospheric chemistry are natural forces within the Earth system. They have occurred many times throughout the planet's history, though rarely on the devastating scale seen during the Great Dying. The key lesson of that ancient catastrophe is not that it was inevitable, but that the systems supporting life on Earth are deeply interconnected. Changes in one part of the planet can ripple outward through the atmosphere, oceans, and ecosystems in ways that are difficult to predict. A shift in atmospheric chemistry can warm the climate. Warming oceans can alter circulation patterns. Changes in circulation can reduce oxygen levels in marine environments, affecting the creatures that depend upon those waters. Each process influences the next. The Earth that survived the Great Dying is not the same planet we live on today, but its fundamental systems still operate according to the same physical principles that govern the ancient world. The planet may appear stable, yet stability has never been permanent. To understand whether a catastrophe like the Great Dying could ever occur again, Scientists must compare the ancient evidence preserved in rock with the changes now taking place in Earth's climate and oceans. When scientists study the Great Dying, they are not only trying to understand what happened long ago, they are also trying to understand how planetary systems behave when they are pushed beyond their limits. The end Permian extinction is more than a historical mystery. It is one of the clearest examples in Earth's history of how multiple environmental changes can interact with one another until entire ecosystems collapse. Researchers who analyze this ancient event often focus on several key processes that unfolded together during the crisis. The first was rapid greenhouse warming. Volcanic eruptions released enormous amounts of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, trapping heat and raising global temperatures. The warming did not simply make the planet hotter. It altered rainfall patterns, intensified droughts in some regions, and disrupted climates that ecosystems had relied upon for millions of years. The second process occurred in the oceans. As temperatures rose, ocean circulation weakened and oxygen levels declined. Vast regions of the sea became anoxic environments, where marine organisms could no longer survive. When oxygen disappears from ocean waters, complex ecosystems collapse quickly, leaving only a few species capable of tolerating such harsh conditions. A third change involved ocean chemistry. As carbon dioxide dissolved into seawater, it increased the acidity of the oceans. This process made it more difficult for marine organisms to build shells or skeletal structures, weakening reef systems and destabilizing marine food webs. Individually, each of these changes would have placed enormous pressure on life. Together, they formed a chain reaction that spread through the atmosphere, oceans, and ecosystems across the planet. Scientists studying the modern world sometimes compare these ancient processes with environmental changes happening today. The comparison does not suggest that the planet is approaching another extinction on the scale of the Great Dying. The conditions that produced that ancient catastrophe were extreme and developed over long geological timescales. But certain underlying processes remain part of Earth's natural systems. Global temperatures can rise when greenhouse gases accumulate in the atmosphere. Ocean chemistry can shift as carbon dioxide dissolves into seawater. Oxygen levels in certain marine environments can decline when circulation patterns weaken. These changes are now carefully monitored by researchers across the world. Ocean oxygen concentrations in deep waters. Climate scientists track global temperature trends. Marine biologists observe how boreal, reefs and other ecosystems respond to shifting conditions. Each observation adds to our understanding of how the planet's systems respond to environmental stress. The purpose of these studies is not to draw dramatic conclusions, but to learn from the only large-scale natural experiment available to us. The Great Dying preserved in ancient rocks offers scientists a rare opportunity to examine how life on Earth responds when multiple environmental pressures occur at the same time. It reveals how ecosystems react when the atmosphere warms rapidly. It shows how marine environments behave when oxygen levels collapse. It demonstrates how fragile the balance of life can become when several planetary systems change together. In this way, the greatest extinction in Earth's history has become one of the most valuable sources of scientific insight. The rocks that record that catastrophe are not simply relics of the past. They are lessons written in stone. By studying those lessons carefully, scientists can better understand the limits of the planet's environmental systems and the ways in which life adapts or fails to adapt to dramatic change. And beyond the science itself lies a deeper question. If life once came so close to disappearing entirely, what does that moment reveal about the fragile balance that sustains the living world today? The story of the Great Dying invites a quiet reflection about the nature of life on Earth. For billions of years, the planet has been a stage for remarkable transformations. Oceans formed where barren rock once stood. Simple cells evolved into forests, reefs, and animals capable of thought and movement. Throughout that immense history, life has endured challenges that would seem almost unimaginable. Asteroids have struck the planet with devastating force. Massive volcanic eruptions have darkened skies and reshaped continents. Ice ages have locked oceans beneath frozen crusts, while warmer climates have melted glaciers and transformed landscapes. Time and again, life has faced moments of crisis. Yet the Permian extinction stands apart from most of these events. It was not merely another environmental disruption or regional disaster. It was a moment when the delicate balance that sustains complex ecosystems nearly collapsed altogether. The biosphere, the thin layer of life surrounding our planet, is an intricate web connecting atmosphere, oceans, geology, and living organisms. Each part influences the others in ways that are often invisible but profoundly important. Plants absorb carbon dioxide and release oxygen into the air. Oceans regulate the planet's temperature by storing heat in circulating water across vast distances. Microorganisms recycle nutrients through soils and sediments, sustaining ecosystems that depend on those hidden processes. These systems work together in remarkable harmony, but they are not indestructible. When several parts of this network begin shifting at the same time, the consequences can spread rapidly through the entire biosphere. Changes in atmospheric chemistry can alter the climate. Climate shifts can disrupt ocean circulation. Ocean changes can affect the survival of marine life, which in turn influences ecosystems on land. During the late Permian crisis, many of these systems began failing together. Volcanic eruptions altered the composition of the atmosphere. Rising temperatures disrupted ocean currents. Oxygen vanished from large portions of the sea. Toxic conditions spread through marine environments. The collapse did not happen because one factor changed. It happened because several systems reached their limits simultaneously. The result was the most severe biological crisis Earth has ever experienced. And yet, even in the face of such overwhelming disruption, life did not vanish completely. Somewhere within the harsh landscapes and unstable oceans of that ancient world, small populations of organisms endured. A handful of species survived conditions that eliminated nearly everything else. Those survivors carried the future of life within them. Over time, they adapted to the recovering planet, spreading into empty environments and slowly rebuilding ecosystems that had once collapsed. The recovery took millions of years, but it happened. Forests returned to the continents. Oceans filled again with diverse marine life. New evolutionary lineages appeared, eventually giving rise to the animals that would dominate later ages. The story of the Great Dying therefore carries two powerful messages. It reminds us how fragile complex ecosystems can be when planetary systems fall out of balance. But it also reveals the extraordinary resilience of life itself. Life on Earth has survived the edge of extinction before. Yet every survival reshapes the future of the planet. The world that emerged after the Great Dying was not the same one that had existed before. Entire branches of evolution had disappeared forever, while new groups began exploring opportunities created by the extinction. In the long arc of Earth's history, this ancient catastrophe became a turning point. From the quiet resilience of its survivors would eventually emerge new dynasties of life, dinosaurs, mammals, and ultimately the species capable of looking back across deep time and asking how it all happened. As millions of years passed after the Great Dying, the Earth slowly began to change again. The harsh, unstable world that had followed the extinction did not remain forever. Gradually, the forces that had driven the crisis weakened, and the planet began settling into a new rhythm. But the world that was emerging no longer resembled the Permian planet that had existed before the catastrophe. The extinction had removed so many dominant species that ecosystems were forced to rebuild themselves from the very beginning. Entire evolutionary lineages had vanished, leaving empty roles across land and sea. In their absence, new forms of life began quietly exploring possibilities that had never existed before. Across the continents, plants slowly returned to landscapes that had once been barren and eroded. Early forests spread cautiously across the land, stabilizing soils that had been stripped away during the worst years of environmental collapse. Roots held the ground in place once more. Rivers that had once carried thick currents of mud and debris began flowing more clearly again. With vegetation anchoring the land, erosion slowed, and ecosystems slowly regained the stability they had lost. Climate patterns also began shifting toward greater balance. The immense volcanic eruptions that had once flooded the atmosphere with greenhouse gases had long since faded into silence. Over time, carbon dioxide levels declined, and temperatures gradually softened from the extreme heat that had once dominated the planet. The world was becoming more hospitable again. In the oceans, signs of transformation were equally clear. New reef-building organisms appeared in the recovering seas. These reefs were not identical to the ancient systems that had vanished during the extinction. Instead, they were built by different groups of organisms experimenting with ways to survive in the altered marine environment. These reefs formed the foundations for new ecosystems. Within them, fish and invertebrates diversified into unfamiliar forms. Predator and prey relationships became more structured as marine food chains regained complexity. The oceans that had once been nearly emptied of life were slowly filling again with movement and interaction. Yet the most dramatic changes were unfolding on land. The reptiles that had survived the extinction were now evolving rapidly into new shapes and lifestyles. With so many ecological niches left vacant, these animals began spreading into environments that had once been dominated by species that no longer existed. Some reptiles evolved into swift hunters capable of chasing prey across open plains and recovering forests. Others adapted to herbivorous diets, feeding on plants that had returned to the stabilizing landscapes. Each generation brought new variations, new experiments in anatomy and behavior. The planet was not merely recovering, it was reinventing itself. Evolution was exploring pathways that had once been blocked by the dominance of earlier species. In the absence of those competitors, entirely new groups of animals began gaining opportunities to expand. Slowly, the ecosystems of the early Triassic grew more diverse, forests deepened, rivers supported growing populations of aquatic life. The oceans regained the layered complexity that had once defined marine ecosystems, and among the reptiles diversifying across the continents, one evolutionary lineage was beginning to gain an advantage. At first it remained only one branch among many quietly adapting to the recovering world. Yet within this group lay traits that would soon allow its descendants to spread farther and dominate more completely than any land animals before them. The extinction that nearly ended life had also cleared the stage for something entirely new. A new age was beginning, and within that new age the ancestors of dinosaurs were preparing to rise. In the long recovery that followed the Great Dying, the continents were no longer dominated by a single powerful group of animals. The extinction had erased the rulers of the Permian world, leaving ecosystems open to new competitors. Across the landscapes of the early Triassic, many reptile lineages spread through the recovering environments, each exploring the opportunities left behind by the vanished species. The world had become an evolutionary contest. Among these competitors were the archosaurs, a group of reptiles that had survived the extinction alongside many others. At first they held no obvious advantage over the creatures around them. Early Triassic ecosystems contained a variety of reptilian forms, some descended from ancient lineages that had dominated before the extinction, others newly evolving into unfamiliar shapes and behaviors. For a time, no single group clearly controlled the recovering world. Yet the archosaurs possessed certain traits that would gradually change the balance. Their limbs were positioned beneath their bodies rather than sprawling outward along the ground. This posture allowed them to move with greater efficiency across land. Instead of dragging their bodies close to the surface, they could stand taller and travel with more energy conserved in each step. In a landscape where food sources and habitats were still unevenly distributed, this efficiency mattered. Archosaurs could roam farther in search of prey or territory. They could explore environments that required endurance and mobility, crossing open plains and scattered forests that were beginning to return to the continents. Their respiratory systems may also have offered an advantage. The atmosphere of the early Triassic still carried lingering effects from the extinction crisis. Oxygen levels had not yet fully returned to the richer concentrations that existed before the catastrophe. Animals capable of exchanging oxygen more efficiently had a better chance of thriving in such conditions. Over time, these subtle advantages allowed archosaurs to expand into ecological roles that had once been filled by extinct species. Some evolved into predators capable of pursuing prey across newly forming landscapes. Their upright posture and agile bodies allowed them to move quickly through open environments where speed could determine survival. Others adapted to different niches, exploring habitats near rivers, lakes, and coastlines. From these early experiments would eventually arise the ancestors of crocodiles, animals that still survive today as distant reminders of this ancient lineage. But within the archosaurs, one branch was beginning to take shape that would eventually become something entirely new. These animals were the earliest dinosaurs. At first they were small and relatively rare. Fossil evidence suggests that the first dinosaurs lived alongside many other reptiles for millions of years without immediately dominating the planet. They were simply another group of adaptable creatures, navigating a recovering world. Yet, the evolutionary stage had already been set in their favor. The extinction that had nearly erased life had also removed countless competitors that might otherwise have prevented dinosaurs from expanding. Ecosystems once crowded with powerful animals were now open to exploration by species capable of adapting to the new conditions. In this altered world, dinosaurs gradually found their opportunity. The age of dinosaurs did not begin with their sudden arrival. It began with an extinction that had cleared the ground beneath them. Without the Great Dying, the evolutionary paths that led to these remarkable animals might never have opened. The disaster that devastated life on Earth had quietly reshaped the future of evolution. Over millions of years, the descendants of those early dinosaurs would grow larger, more diverse, and more dominant than any land animals before them. Yet the consequences of the Great Dying did not end with the rise of dinosaurs. The extinction had influenced another lineage as well, one that would remain small and hidden for millions of years, quietly evolving in the shadows of the reptilian giants. And from that lineage, a very different future would eventually emerge. If we could watch the Earth across the vast sweep of time that followed the Great Dying, the consequences of that ancient catastrophe would appear again and again, shaping events long after the eruptions had faded and ecosystems had begun to recover. The extinction did not simply end one chapter of life's history. It redirected everything that followed. As the Triassic period unfolded, the animals that had survived the crisis continued evolving within the recovering ecosystems. Among them were the early dinosaurs, descendants of archosaurs that had slowly expanded into roles left vacant by the extinction. Over millions of years, these animals diversified into remarkable forms. Some grew into massive herbivores capable of feeding on the high vegetation of expanding forests. Others became swift and intelligent predators that hunted across plains and river valleys. Their bodies adapted to nearly every environment the planet offered. Eventually, dinosaurs would dominate the Earth for more than 160 million years. During that immense stretch of time, they became the rulers of land ecosystems across the globe. Yet beneath their dominance, another evolutionary story was quietly unfolding. Hidden in forests, burrows and shadowed environments, lived the distant ancestors of mammals. These animals descended from synapsids, creatures that had once flourished before the Permian extinction, but had suffered devastating losses during the Great Dying. The survivors of that lineage were small and adaptable, rather than competing directly with the increasingly powerful reptiles of the Triassic and later periods. These early mammal ancestors lived cautiously within ecological niches where larger animals rarely ventured. Many were likely nocturnal, emerging under the cover of darkness, when predators were less active. Their small bodies required less food, allowing them to survive in environments where resources were limited. They lived quietly in the background of Earth's ecosystems while the age of dinosaurs unfolded around them. For millions of years, these small creatures remained overshadowed by the giants that dominated the planet. Yet their survival can be traced back to the harsh conditions of the Great Dying. The extinction had forced their ancestors to adapt to extreme environments where flexibility and resilience mattered more than size or strength. Traits that allowed them to endure unstable climates and limited resources became deeply embedded within their evolutionary lineage. Those same traits would prove valuable long after the extinction itself had passed. Millions of years later, another catastrophe would strike the Earth. The asteroid impact that ended the age of dinosaurs. When that disaster removed the dominant reptiles that had ruled for so long, mammals suddenly found themselves in a world filled with empty ecological roles. Just as archosaurs had once expanded after the Permian extinction, mammals now spread rapidly across the planet. From those small survivors emerged countless species exploring new environments. Some adapted to life in forests. Others moved into open plains or returned to the oceans. Over time, mammals diversified into the vast array of animals that now populate the Earth. Among those evolving lineages were primates, and from one branch of primates, millions of years later, emerged a species capable of studying the rocks beneath its feet and asking questions about the deep past. In this way, the shadow of the Great Dying reaches all the way to the present. The extinction that nearly erased life also helped shape the evolutionary path that eventually allowed humans to exist. or story, in a distant and unexpected way, is connected to that ancient crisis. Yet beyond the evolutionary consequences lies an even deeper lesson, because the Great Dying reminds us that the survival of life on Earth has always depended on a delicate balance between the forces that shape our planet and the organisms that inhabit it. As the story of the Great Dying reaches its final chapter, a larger picture begins to emerge, one that extends far beyond a single extinction event in Earth's distant past. Life on this planet exists within a delicate network of systems that operate together in quiet coordination. The atmosphere regulates and provides the gases that organisms breathe. Oceans circulate heat across the globe while storing enormous amounts of energy and carbon. Geological processes shape the continents, recycle minerals, and influence the chemistry of both land and sea. For most of Earth's history, these systems have worked in remarkable balance. Rain falls across forests that absorb carbon from the air. Oceans support vast communities of organisms that influence atmospheric chemistry. Microscopic life in soils and sediments breaks down organic matter, returning nutrients to ecosystems that depend on them. The entire biosphere functions as a living network. These connections can become when multiple environmental pressures occur at the same time. During the late Apophis, no single disaster had life on Earth. There was no lone asteroid impact or isolated caliphate. Instead, the catastrophe unfolded as a cascade of interacting changes. Massive volcanic eruptions altered the chemistry of the atmosphere, releasing greenhouse gases that trapped heat around the planet. Rising global temperatures disrupted the circulation of the oceans, weakening currents that once carried oxygen into deeper waters. As oxygen levels declined, marine ecosystems began collapsing. Without stay conditions developed in parts of the sea, hydrogen sulfide bacteria may have spread through stagnant waters, releasing gases that threatened both marine and terrestrial life. Each change amplified the next. The warming atmosphere intensified ocean stagnation. Ocean stagnation weakened marine ecosystems. The ecosystems disrupted food chains across the planet. Individually, many of these processes might not have caused a global extinction. Combined together, they formed a chain reaction powerful enough. Earth systems are incredibly resilient. Over billions of years, life has endured ice ages, asteroid impacts, volcanic eruptions, and dramatic shifts in climate again and again. Ecosystems have recovered and adapted to new conditions. Resilience does not mean invulnerability. The same connections that allow the planet to support life can also amplify disturbances when several systems shift at once. A change in the atmosphere can influence the oceans. Changes in the oceans can affect the chemistry of the air and the stability of ecosystems on land. The planet functions as an integrated whole. When that balance holds, life flourishes in extraordinary diversity. When it falters, even the most stable ecosystems can unravel with surprising speed. The Great Dying dramatic example of this principle in Earth's history. It was not simply a disaster. It was a moment when multiple natural systems crossed thresholds simultaneously, creating conditions that almost eliminated complex life. And yet, despite the devastation, the planet eventually recovered. Life rebuilt itself from scattered survivors, filling the world once more with forests, reefs, and countless species exploring new evolutionary paths. The story reminds us that Earth is both powerful and fragile. The systems that sustain life are vast and interconnected, capable of supporting incredible diversity for millions of years. Those that ripple through the entire planet, understanding that delicate balance leads to an important question, one that scientists continue asking today. What lessons can we learn from the greatest biologicals that Earth has ever experienced? Gorka more than quarter greatens mayam fakir, waka day. Scientists around the world still study the rocks, fossils, and chemical traces left behind by that ancient crisis, searching for clues that can deepen our understanding of the planet we inhabit. Each discovery adds another detail to a puzzle that spans continents and oceans. Sedimentary rocks contain the remains of creatures that lived and died during the extinction, Fossil shells and bones reveal which species vanished and which endured. Meanwhile, microscopic traces locked within the minerals of those rocks record subtle changes in atmospheric chemistry, ocean circulation, and climate condition. By examining these clues carefully, scientists can reconstruct how the biosphere responded to one of the most severe environmental disruptions in Earth's history. These investigations do more than explain a single extinction event. They reveal how the planet's systems behave when pushed toward their limits. Scientists study the shifts in greenhouse gases that occurred during the Permian crisis to understand how large-scale warming can influence global ecosystems. Oceanographers analyze chemical markers preserved in marine sediments to learn how oxygen levels changed in seas. Paleontologists examine the fossil record to trace how entire food webs collapsed and later rebuilt themselves from a handful of survivors. Together, these fields create a detailed picture of how life interacts with the Earth's atmosphere, oceans, and geological forces. One of the most valuable insights from these studies involves the idea of tipping points. Natural systems are long periods of time, even as pressures slowly build beneath the surface. But when those pressures reach certain thresholds, change can happen rapidly. Ecosystems that once seemed resilient can suddenly collapse faster than they are able to recover. The Great Drying offers one of the clearest examples of such a tipping point in the planet's history. It demonstrates how several environmental stresses, warming temperatures, declining oxygen levels, and chemical changes in the oceans combined to push life beyond its limits. Understanding those processes allows scientists to recognize similar patterns when studying other moments in Earth's past. Yet, the purpose of studying this ancient extinction is not to create fear about the future. Instead, it provides a rare opportunity to observe how the Earth system behaves during a planetary-scale crisis. In many ways, the Permian extinction acts as a natural laboratory preserved in stone. No experiment in modern science could recreate such an event, but the geological record allows researchers to examine the outcome of environmental changes that unfolded over hundreds of thousands of years. The rocks beneath our feet hold the results of that experiment. They show how ecosystems responded when climate shifted rapidly. They reveal how ocean chemistry changed when vast amounts of carbon entered the atmosphere. And they demonstrate how life rebuilt itself after nearly disappearing. With every new discovery, scientists refine their understanding of how the planet's systems interact. The story of the Great Dying continues to influence research in fields ranging from climate science to evolutionary biology. It reminds us that the past is not merely a collection of distant events. The planet's history remains a guide for understanding the forces that shape the world today. The rocks beneath our feet are not just records of what once happened. They are instructions written by the planet itself, and as scientists continue reading those instructions, the ancient crisis that nearly erased life on Earth continues teaching us about the fragile systems that sustain it. With that under chapter of this story returns to a quieter question. What does the Great Dying ultimately reveal about the resilience for life of the finer ability? Of life on our world, about 252 million years ago, the Earth passed through the most dangerous chapter in the history of life. The planet had any upheavals before. Continents had drifted across the globe. Ice ages volcanoes had erupted, and seas had risen and fallen. But nothing in the long record of the planet had prepared the biosphere for what unfolded during the final days of the Permian world. The crisis did not arrive as a single violent moment. It emerged gradually, as if the planet itself was shifting into an unfamiliar state. The atmosphere grew warmer and heavier with greenhouse gases. Ocean currents that once circulated oxygen through the depths began slowing. Entire marine ecosystems, which had thrived for hundreds of millions of years, suddenly struggled to survive. The seas themselves began changing. Regions that had once supported vibrant reefs and countless species became stagnant and depleted of oxygen. In some places, toxic gases may have risen from the depths, turning the water hostile to creatures that had once flourished there. Life that had evolved slowly across immense spans of time began disappearing with startling speed. Reef ecosystems collapsed. Trilobites, animals that had survived since some of the earliest chapters of complex life, vanished forever. Many groups of marine organisms that had dominated ancient oceans were erased entirely. The devastation did not remain confined to the seas on land. Rising temperatures and unstable climates stripped vegetation from vast regions. Forests disappeared from scapes that had once supported reed schooners. Herbivores that depended on those plants began declining, followed by predators that relied on them for food. The intricate web of ecosystems that sustained life began unraveling. Life began unraveling. Over a relatively short interval of time, the fossil record shows that approximately 90% of marine species disappeared. On land, nearly 70% of vertebrate species vanished as well. No extinction before or since has matched the scale of that loss. For a brief moment, in the deep history of Earth, the future of complex life was uncertain. The biosphere had been pushed to the edge. Yet, even in the most hostile environments of that ancient world, life refused to disappear completely. Somewhere within the damaged oceans, small populations of organisms endured. A handful of species survived conditions that eliminated nearly everything else. Those survivors carried the future of life forward. From their fragile foothold in the recovering world, plants returned to barren land. Communities emerged in the slowly healing seas. Evolution explored fresh pathways opened by the disappearance of older lineages. Over millions of years, the descendants of those survivors spread across the planet, gave rise to new dynasties of life. Dinosaurs would dominate the continents for more than 160 million years. Mammals would later diversify into the forms that populate the modern world. And eventually, one species would emerge capable of studying ancient rocks and reconstructing the story of that distant catastrophe. In that sense, the Great Dying is not only a story about extinction. The Catastrophe also shaped the evolutionary path that allowed humanity to appear millions of years later. When viewed from space today, the Earth turns quietly beneath its thin atmosphere. Oceans shimmer in reflected sunlight. Forests stretch across continents, but lay through slay. The planet appears calm and stable. Yet deep within its rocks lies the memory of a moment when life came closer to extinction than at any other time in its history. The greatest extinction was not the end of life's story. It was the moment the future nearly vanished, and the fact that life continued at all remains one of the most extraordinary outcomes in the history of our world.